Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly nostalgia podcast about the best of technology and culture from the mid-20th century.
Welcome back to Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk all about the best of the mid-20th century and how to add vintage vibes to your modern life. We're your hosts, Jackie
and Gonzalo. So today, thank you for joining us first, but also we are going to be talking about motels, roadside motels, the interstate system, and all fun MCM and mid-century roadside sleeping accommodations. But first, Jackie, how was your day or week?
My week was good. By the time this comes out, we'll have gotten through the Disney Bound Challenge. I just realized I forgot to update everyone last episode. I mentioned that to get all of the outfits that I wanted to do, I was going to have to sew 2 things. Well, I only sewed one of those things. But the one that I did sew, I was using in multiple outfits, so it was more practical. The other one is a dress that I was going to try to rush and finish for the Disney Bound Challenge, but I've decided to instead wait and take my time because I'm going to do, I don't know how good, interesting radio this will be, but I'm basically going to try to convert a pattern that already fits me, which is great, so that the hard part's done. But from a back zip closure to a button-down front closure.
Very 1940s.
Which I've read a bunch of tutorials on it, and it doesn't seem that hard. Basically, you're just instead of cutting the front on the fold, you add in seam allowance and enough for to put your buttons and the button closure on the other side, and then you have to draft new facings for it. It seems doable, and normally I'm afraid of projects like that, so maybe I just used it was too quick of a turnaround for the Disney Bound Challenge, I'll wait and give it maybe that is actually me subconsciously afraid to make buttons. I've only really done buttonholes on 2 projects. They're okay. I don't know why I'm so intimidated by making buttonholes, probably because I have one of those really complicated 4-step buttonhole things on my machine. Some people have really fancy 1-step buttonhole. Yep. And now I'm in the weeds and the sewing stuff. But anyway.
I know the word buttons and seams.
When I originally envisioned this dress, I was just going to put fake buttons down the front and just leave the zipper in the back. But I have noticed I have been challenging myself a lot less with sewing. I tend to just, once I find a pattern I like, I just tend to make it again a million times in different colors. And I mean, part of the magic of learning to sew is that you can just conjure up stuff from the ether and make it happen. And I think just sticking to the same 3 patterns that I know and trust is playing it too safe, and I should probably make some braver decisions. So this project is going to be a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but it's still on my list. I just decided not to rush and do it just for this challenge. I'm going to give it the time it deserves. So that's good. What's going on in my life.
The extent of my ability to sew things is to add buttons. No, sorry, not add buttons. Let me rephrase that. Replace it when a button falls off.
That's great.
Yeah, that's all I know how to do.
I'm so glad that you can do that, because you hear all those stories of men who, when they lose a button, they just throw out the shirt. And that is so wasteful and annoying. You can't learn to sew a button.
I learned to do a button when I had to wear dress shirts to work every day.
Good for you. I'm proud of you for that.
Yeah.
But honestly, the only way I'm going to get better at making buttonholes is if I just make buttonholes. So
yeah,
that's the only way. You just got to practice. So I'm gonna practice. So wish me luck, everybody.
Good luck.
So that's what's going on with me. How was your week?
My week was great because this is a very weird phrase. My week was great because my week I'm talking about is the week that has not happened yet. Because by the time this episode comes out, I will have returned from a trip back home to Argentina, which I'm taking this past week, which is really 2 weeks from now. So I'm excited. I haven't been back in years. So I'm gonna go visit for a few days and eat all the food.
I was just gonna say, are you so excited to eat?
I'm going to come back in a wheelbarrow. They're gonna have to wheel me through customs at the airport, because I'm gonna be eating all of the food. Because if you are listening to us from Argentina, you know how good the food is. If you're not, go visit Argentina, because the food is amazing. It's like European food, but not in Europe, because it's in South America. That makes sense in my head. And what I mean by that is chocolate and stuff like that. I'm sorry, US, but your chocolate here is no good. It's like super sweet and like very sugary. And like you go to Belgium and like the chocolate there is amazing. And that's more the kind of chocolate that we have in Argentina.
Yes.
You've had Belgian chocolate, right?
Yes, and I'm familiar with the differences between American style chocolate and European style chocolate.
Yeah.
Even in Canada, like their Kit Kats taste better because they use a different chocolate on the outside than
Yeah.
we do here. It's very interesting.
On my list to eat, we have really good bakeries, and I'm looking forward to eating all of the baked goods, all of them.
I can't wait to hear all about the food chat when you get back in 2 weeks.
Will definitely have food chat.
So this is food chat part 1 and then food chat part 2 later. I'm excited. Hopefully everyone else loves food chat as much as we do, but I genuinely love hearing, like, I mean, this is why the Food Network is so popular. Like, people like watching and listening to people talk about food.
Yes.
It's a thing.
Yes. But
well, I'm so excited for you.
Anyway, we should probably get back to our episode,
Yes.
But because I'm going to be talking about traveling in the next weekly catch up, today's episode's about traveling as well.
Genius. Really good transition.
Some I've had better.
So we should begin at the beginning, and it may be obvious to everyone, but you never know. What is a motel? Is it just a hotel that was misspelled?
Kinda.
Honestly, I always assumed, and I guess we're going to find out, that the difference between a motel and a hotel is in motels, the doors are on the outside.
And yes, that is one of the reasons. But that's not where the M comes from. It's not outside.
I never really thought about where did the M come from. I just was like, oh, the difference is the doors are on the outside. But let's figure out where the M comes from. So a motel is also known as a motor hotel. Oh, a motor inn or a motor lodge. So it's just a shortening of motor hotel.
Yes.
Cute. It is a hotel specifically designed for motorists, usually having rooms that are entered directly from the parking area instead of from a lobby. See, I know stuff. So that drivers can more easily access the facilities. The word motel actually did not enter the dictionary until after World War II. Well, hey, that's our time frame.
Yeah.
It was coined as a portmanteau of motor hotel. It originates from the now defunct establishment, the Millston Motel in San Luis Obispo, California, which was later renamed to the Motel Inn from 1925. Also worth mentioning, because this is an audio podcast, they spelled motel with a hyphen between the M-O and the T-E-L, which makes it look more like it's an abbreviation than the word motel does now. But more on that motel soon. Sometimes the rooms are connected or open to a shared common area. Also, motels were and are usually individually owned, though some motel chains do exist. Often laid out in an I, L, or U-shaped layout that had guest rooms, an attached manager's office, a small reception or gathering spot, and sometimes even a small diner or swimming pool.
Yes. Like most of our episodes, though, everything in the mid-century is connected. The need for inexpensive, easily accessible overnight accommodations close to main traffic routes is nothing new, especially as society progressed into the 20th century. So really, let me put my resident history nerd hat on again. I almost said hard hat, and I feel like sometimes I need that. But only for a very quick second. So, this is going to be fun. You could technically trace motels all the way back to the Silk Road. Yes, the Silk Road. Because we could say that this episode goes back all the way to like 130 BCE.
Neat.
We're not going to spend too much time there. We're going to come back to the mid-century in a second, like 2 or 3 sentences. But you could trace this need for overnight accommodations to the caravanserai, which were these roadside inns along the Silk Road where caravans could rest for the night, resupply, and continue to travel the next day. And this eventually led to the creation of cities along the roads.
I think that's a new record for our ancient history section of the episode.
I think so.
But let's get back to the mid-century. Or at least closer to it.
Yes. So as the Roaring Twenties roared on, long-distance journeys by road became common, increasing this need for rest spots and the growth of motor inns or motor lodges. And that's why we can trace the motel to another mid-century innovation, the interstate system. So this actually might not be the interstate system is really cool, but it's probably not enough for a full mid-century episode. Maybe we should do like shorter format episodes for those topics that are too niche or like not enough for a full 30-minute episode.
I think that's actually a really good idea because there are. I mean, I've thought of a couple things that I just don't think I can stretch out to 30 minutes either. So, listeners, what do you think? Does that sound like something you'd be into? Like mini episodes? Either send us some fan mail in the text message button in the show notes or send us a DM on Instagram if you think you would be into that.
Yeah, and maybe we'll release some shorter episodes. But back to the interstate system, the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, yes, that is its full legal name. Usually it's just known as Interstate Highway System. However, is a national network of controlled access highways that extends throughout the contiguous US and also has routes in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And highways really began to be a thing in about 1926 as the US numbered highway system, quote, paved the way. And that was a pun that I came up with.
Good one.
By creating cross-country travel roads. And these were funded by the state and had few national standards for design. So sometimes they were 2-lane country roads, sometimes they were multi-lane freeways. It kind of varied. And that all changed in the mid-century as Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953, eventually sponsoring the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This really unified standards for construction and signage, so they'd all be the same, and took over some of the existing routes, creating new ones as well. And as of 2022, about 1/4 of all vehicle miles driven in the USA are driven on a road that belongs to the interstate highway system, which has a total of 48,890 miles. That's 78,600 kilometers for those of us listening from outside of the US. But that is, we need the interstate system for the cars, and we need the cars for the travelers who then need the overnight accommodations that we find in motels.
So it's all connected.
It's all connected.
So before there were motels, there were auto camps. These are simply campgrounds along travel routes. These can be traced back to the 20s. They're usually primitive municipal campsites which grew into for-profit commercial camps as demand increased. In the 1930s, travel trailers became common, which would use auto camps as a stopping point at night, which eventually grew into cabin camps, which is more permanent style structures. During the Great Depression in the mid to late 30s, landholders who had properties adjacent to highways built cabins so that their lands could generate money. And the DIY craze, which, by the way, we did an episode on, DIY in the mid-century, go check it out, it lent itself well to this, and plans for instructions for roadside motels or cabin courts could easily be found in how-to and builders magazines. These early stopping points could be rented for $1 a night, but were not exactly comfortable. These were popular throughout the Great Depression, but after World War II began to decrease in popularity due to high land costs and drivers wanting more modern amenities. So then we get to early motels. Like we mentioned earlier, the word motel came from the Milestone Motel with a hyphen in California, constructed by Arthur Heinemann, who combined the words motor and hotel into motel simply because he could not fit the words Milestone Motor Hotel on the sign on the roof.
Yes, that's why there's a hyphen.
That is so funny.
He just ran out of space.
Ran out of space, invents a whole word that will eventually become part of the dictionary. So good for that guy. Many other business owners began to do the same and started building their own motor courts and named them motels. Combining the individual cabins of the auto camps under a single roof yielded a building. These became popular as an alternative to the costly established downtown hotels where bell captains, porters, and other personnel would expect tipping after providing a service.
Yes, so in a great turn of events, in today's episode, when we reach the mid-century, I'm going to take over.
Fine.
So in the 1940s, during the war, most construction stopped. Obviously, the fuel, rubber, and workers were needed for the war effort. So post-war, we see a building boom. And we've talked about it before, but it also affected the travel industry. By 1947, 22,000 motor courts were in operation in the US alone. A typical motel costs about $3,000 per room to build for 50 bedrooms, while a metropolitan city hotel in comparison would cost about $12,000 per room. This meant that motels became more desirable by the owners, right? By 1950, about 50,000 motels served half of the 22 million of US vacationers who traveled throughout its routes. In 1951, more people stayed in motels than in hotels. And the industry peaked in 1964 with 61,000 motels throughout the USA, a number that would fall to just 16,000 by the year 2012. The 1950s and 60s is also where we see the best part of roadside motels, the Googie architecture that we discussed in episode 36, Googie architecture, as well as other novelty kitschy things like wigwams and teepees, but more on this later. The mid-century was the pinnacle of motel industry. Older motels began to add newer amenities like pools or color TVs, which remember in the 1960s, they were a luxury. Often also advertising such amenities on large, colorful neon signs. Also, many began advertising other luxuries like having, quote, air cooling, which is what they called it, which in the summer, which is like an AC, and then being heated by steam in the winter. In-room gimmicks became a thing too. Here are some of the things from motels of the mid-century that should bring back some memories for those travelers who were young back then, or at least some things you'll never see in motels again if you are not from the century. So metal keys. Now we have those little plastic cards, right? But mid-century motels, and I guess also hotels, had metal keys with like kitschy plastic keychains that often would have the information on the motel on the keychain. So if you accidentally took it home, you could just drop it off in a letterbox and it would find its way back home.
Oh.
The motels would also have little key cubbies, and these are like little cubbies behind the front desk for the motel workers to hold the keys, which would also help because the staff could very easily see which rooms were available, because if the key is gone, someone's in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Vibrating beds were a thing.
Yes, I was wondering if you were going to bring these up.
Yes, of course. So these were beds that vibrated to, quote, massage its sleepers that started in the 1950s. Now, vibrating beds were a little clunky, though, and many small motel owners didn't want to replace their existing beds with these big models. So we had this guy, his name is John Hutling, and he was a traveling salesman who sold vibrating beds. And he realized that the important part was the actual motor of the bed, or that shook the bed. So he developed one that could be attached to any existing mattress, and he called it the Magic Fingers massaging bed. So, which is great.
This is so tacky. I can't believe it was actually from the 50s. I could have sworn the 70s were to blame for this thing.
Oh no, it was much earlier. And actually, what it attached to the box spring. So the box spring is what shook, not the mattress.
That makes sense.
But this was a coin-operated device. So you put a quarter in, and you got 50 minutes of vibrating. And at its high point, there were roughly 250,000 Magic Finger units installed nationwide when they reached their peak of popularity in the 1960s, with each unit averaging 8 quarters per week, bringing in $2 million in monthly gross revenue, which is a lot of money.
Yeah, that's awesome for the hotel people.
Yes.
Or the motel people.
These were so popular that they kind of became part of like Americana. They've been featured on shows like The Simpsons and The X-Files, as well as in songs by Frank Zappa and Jimmy Buffett, both of whom are in songs related to motels, which I like were a thing.
Why not?
Yeah. Another thing from the mid-century motels were guest books. These were handwritten books where guests would sign in and then give a lot of their info. They weren't like the front desk person would do it. Like you, the guest, would go and sign the book. So you, the guest, would have access to looking at information of other people. Mm-hmm. And so they became a little bit less popular after movies like Psycho came out, and people realized that it was kind of an invasion of privacy to have all that information.
Yeah, it sort of is. And I was picturing Psycho while you were talking about it.
Yeah.
So advertising for motels was tricky. Most of the mid-century motels were locally owned and small mom-and-pop style businesses, often around 2-lane highways. Quality varied greatly between each, and there were no real standards. Towns along highways became peppered with large neon signs proclaiming vacancy, or multicolored neon signs that would advertise color TV in alternating colors. Here's where the mid-century really shines, though. We'll have to post some of these on Instagram. But they were often larger than life, would have, like, obviously the motel's name in really large letters. Many elements of Googie architecture are seen in these signs. Often each letter of motel was in its own spot, with varying sizes of backgrounds. Arrows would usually be a big part of the sign design, pointing the driver towards the motel itself. All amenities would be advertised. The signs would have information on the hotel having color TV or air conditioning, vibrating beds, or swimming pools. The vacancy, no vacancy sign became popular. Motels could let drivers know if they had space. Stop here, we have a room.
Yeah.
This is also where we see the beginnings of chains. So motels in the late 1950s were so popular and profitable that companies were able to build multiples. These became properties with common architecture and sometimes owned by a small group of people or even franchisees. One of the first, the Alamo Plaza Hotel Courts, were founded in East Waco, Texas, and by 1955 had more than 20 motels. With Simmons furniture, Beauty West mattresses on every bed, and telephones in every room, the Alamo Plaza rooms were marketed as tourist apartments under a slogan of catering to those who care. These used mission style, remember the Alamo and how it looked, and formed a U shape of rooms with a court in the center.
Yes, and there's one of these in Houston that I would often drive past whenever I went to U of H because it was off Old Spanish Trail, which is actually Old US 90. But this one remained the Alamo Plaza Motor Hotel while I lived nearby. But its once hotel style porters and room service were long gone by the time that I drove by it. At the time, it looked like it was like deteriorating badly, kind of being, maybe being used, maybe not. Like I remember driving by and being like, this looks like a cool building. I want to drive into it, but then also be like, I don't want to die. Turns out it was renting rooms by the hour at that time for $10 for every 2 hours.
Yikes.
Yes, so I'm glad I never actually went into it. But today, it looks like it's been remodeled, though its original facade still remains. It's been painted, and it's supposed to be low-cost housing, which, in my opinion, is what all like unused motels and hotels really should become. Like, if instead of letting them decay and stay vacant, they should be repurposed into low-cost housing because I'm sure that every part of the states needs that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, but it's really cool. Like, and that like memory of driving past the Alamo Hotel or the Alamo Motel or the Plaza, whatever it's called, off Old Spanish Trail. That was always been in the back of my mind. It's like a topic that I want to cover on this podcast. But that's actually what's the influence? Not the influence. Inspiration for this episode.
Cool. And little did you know, back when you were in college, like, one day I'm going to write a podcast about you. You could have said,
I know.
Motel. One more famous motel is probably known to our listeners. This was a motel started in 1951 by residential developer Kemmons Wilson. He returned from a family road trip upset that motels varied greatly between spots. The quality of rooms went from well-kept to filthy. Few had a swimming pool or a restaurant. So he built his own motel, taking the name from the musical film Holiday Inn, and vowed for a chain in which all rooms would have TV and air conditioning and all locations would have a restaurant and swimming pool. Basically a way for travelers to have the same experience in Memphis as someone having the same staying at the same motel in Daytona Beach.
So yes, that is the Holiday Inn, which we all know as the Holiday Inn hotel chain, which obviously is no longer a motel, but that was its humble beginnings. But motels themselves were pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit about what those motels were like in the mid-century. Since motels peaked in the mid-century, there's a lot of mid-century and MCM architecture and concepts within the motels. Like we mentioned earlier, the motels typically were in an I, L, or U shape with rooms that opened in the shared motor court. So if they all look the same, how do you make one more appealing than the other? Really, that's the question. So I have a couple I want to talk about that are like peak mid-century. Obviously, the Alamo Plaza Motor Court we've already covered with Alamo facade prompting drivers to stop there for the night. And others use similar catchy tactics. So another one is the Wigwam Motels, or also known as the Wigwam Villages.
I'm very excited to hear about the wigwams.
These were mostly built during the 1940s. They were catchy because each room was built in the form of giant teepees, oftenly mistaken as wigwams, in a concept developed by a man named Frank Redford. 7 of these motels were built across Kentucky, Alabama, Florida, Arizona, Louisiana, and California, but only 3 of them survive today, with one in Kentucky and one in Arizona on the National Register of Historic Places.
Cool.
Yes, so you might have seen these in popular culture. They're very much like you recognizable. Like you recognize them. Anyway, I'm just gonna talk about 2 real quickly. Village number 2, which is in Cave City, Kentucky, which is one of the ones in the National Register, and this one consists of 15 wigwams used as guest rooms that are arranged in a semicircle. In the center is a much bigger concrete and steel structure that originally was a restaurant, plus also a common area with like a playground, recreation space, and a pavilion. Each teepee is 14 feet in diameter, 32 feet tall, with a bathroom behind the main room and a window-mounted air conditioning. Today, it is still under operation. Each room has cable TV and internet access, but to keep it in type with its original creation, there's no phones, which I found was an odd thing. But hey, and also Village Number 6, which is in Holbrook, Arizona. This is the one that is off Route 66, and it was built in 1950 after owner Chester E. Lewis purchased the rights from Radford and installed a coin-operated radios in each room, of which every dime inserted for 30 minutes would be sent to Radford as form of payment for the rights.
Neat.
This motel is arranged in a square with 15 concrete and steel wigwams on 3 sides, and the main office building on the 4th, flanked by 2 smaller-sized wigwams on the side. Lewis operated the motel until its closing in 1974, citing low business, obviously, due to the Interstate 40 bypass being built. But his kids renovated and reopened it in 1988 after his death and continued to operate the motel today. And the last one is the Blue Swallow Court, which is a 12-unit L-shaped motel in New Mexico and part of Route 66 as well. The original architectural features included a facade with pink stucco walls decorated with shell designs and a stepped parapet, on-site office and a manager's residence, and garages located between each of the sleeping units for travelers to park their motor cars. And this can be seen in Back to the Future Part 2, which I don't remember seeing, but now I'm going to have to look for whenever I rewatch that movie, and even inspired Pixar's Cars and its Cozy Cone Motel. It is still under operation. This is one of the longest continuously running motels, and it's billed as, quote, the last, best, and friendliest of the old-time motels by Smithsonian Magazine.
I've always wanted to do the Route 66 thing one day and like go to some of these old kitschy places. I'm going to have to add this to my list. I definitely want to stay in the wigwams. At least once, just to say I did, you know?
Yes. I would like to as well.
There are actually so many cool old motels that we'll put a link of a list of them in our show notes for everybody.
Yeah. But the good times would eventually come to an end. They started obviously to decline, though they thrived in the 50s and 60s. They were really squeezed out of the market in the late 70s and 80s. Many were left stranded on former 2-lane main highways, which had been bypassed by motorways or declined as original owners retired and subsequent proprietors neglected the maintenance of buildings and rooms. The remaining motels would become deteriorated, often becoming low-end motels like the Alamo Plaza in Houston, and weren't exactly known for the cleanest sleeping experience. The term cockroach motel became popular by 1976 after the popular Roach Motel trademarked the name of the Black Flag brand of roach bait device, which were obviously made to catch cockroaches. And they became known also as seedy locations for the homeless, prostitution, and drugs. Some of the land in bypass routes have become valuable now as new suburbs rise in those areas, which also led to the demolition of many of these motels in favor of new developments. Some historic places have been allowed to stay, mostly decaying though. The Motel Inn that we talked about earlier in the original motel with the hyphen, that remains incomplete with what is left of it boarded up after a failed restoration in 2002. The Alamo Plaza hotel courts were sold off in pieces after its owners retired. Its location in Baton Rouge, though, is known as remaining open, but without its restaurant, its pool, or its original color scheme, and actually has become a magnet for criminal activity, with the police summoned daily, as well as a magnet for roaches and other vermin.
Yuck.
From the 2000s on, though, much of the original 1950s roadside infrastructure along now bypass highways has been raised for development, and some preservationists have been fighting to list the endangered properties on many of the federal and state historic registries, which is great, but it doesn't really do much to help the buildings. The Aztec Motel, for example, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1993 and on a state register as well, but was still demolished in 2011.
Boo.
The Coral Court Motel of St. Louis, Missouri, was listed also in the National Register of Historic Places, and that did not help prevent its demolition in 1995. Although, in this case, one of the cabins survives and is part of the exhibit at the National Museum of Transportation after being painstakingly dismantled by volunteers and relocated there.
Oh, that's
so that's
awesome.
actually pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. But since we're talking about demolition now, I think that's a good transition into today, right?
Yeah. That's good.
So today, most mid-century roadside motels have served as a haven for fugitives, especially before local governments started to demand hotels and motels require IDs from its guests. If you were wishing to remain anonymous, you could just pay cash and call it a day. Motels which allow a room to be rented inexpensively for less than one full night's stay have been nicknamed no-tell motels due to their long association with adultery. Motels in low-income areas are often plagued with drug activity, street prostitution, and other crime. But it's not all bad. Some motels from the mid-century became flourishing franchises still active today. For example, Motel 6, which is the largest standalone brand in the economy hotel industry with more than 1,400 locations throughout the US and Canada. It was originally founded in 1962 by William Becker. The name Motel 6 comes from the fact that the rooms cost $6 to rent, which is about $62 in today's money. This started as an alternative to other major chains such as Holiday Inn, which were beginning to change from motel to hotel facilities in the 1960s and beginning to cost more each night. During the chain's early years, Motel 6 emphasized itself as a no-frills lodging chain, with rooms featuring coin-operated black and white television receivers instead of the free color televisions. They were still leaving the light on for travelers, which was their catchphrase slogan, "We'll leave the light on for you."
Yeah.
And the Super 8 Motel, which is also known as the Super 8 by Wyndham. I don't think I've ever said that out loud.
Wyndham Hotels?
Wyndham, yeah. Like, I've read it.
Yeah.
I've never...
Well, that's what makes this one not the biggest standalone, because Motel 6 is not owned by a bigger hotel chain, whereas Super 8 is.
That makes sense. This is the largest budget brand with 2,600 locations worldwide, and it also got its name from its original room cost of $8.88 in the 1970s. The original was built to compete with a nearby Holiday Inn as well.
And although some brands are still operating successfully, many of the original Googie or MCM motels have gone away. But there is hope. The Dead Motels Project is an online campaign, I guess you'd call it campaign, to catalog and remember the long-forgotten motels. Their website lists the following as their mission: to give life to these forgotten motels long after their no vacancy sign has been turned off for the last time. To archive how they looked, why people stayed there, and their ultimate downfall and redevelopment. To highlight changes in American regional tourism, architecture, and travel trends. To push for preservation or continued use of the older motels we have left, especially those that are architecturally unique or have historical significance. And lastly, to spark a sense of nostalgia. You can follow them on Instagram at Dead Motel USA and see some of their amazing photos of mid-century motels there as well.
And motels have been widely successful in media as well. We covered motels a little bit in our episode on Psycho, obviously because it takes place at a hotel. Or, damn it, why don't I just read the script? We covered motels a little bit in our episode on Psycho. The Bates Motel here is an integral part of the novel and movie, and played a part in not just the original film, but also in its sequels, remakes, and TV series. The scenario of an isolated motel being operated by a serial killer whose guests subsequently become victims has been exploited in a number of other horror films, like Motel Hell in 1980 and Vacancy in 2007. Several of these films incorporate a sub-theme of voyeurism where the owner or operator spies on its guests. This plays on the long-established illicit activity connotations of motels. They are often depicted as isolated, rundown, and seedy establishments in movies. But not all media has been unkind to motels. The Canadian sitcom Schitt's Creek was created by Dan Levy and his father Eugene Levy, and it aired on CBS from 2015 to 2020. It follows the trials and tribulations of the formerly wealthy Rose family after they lose their fortune and are forced to relocate to the town of Schitt's Creek, which was once purchased as a joke gift. The family is forced to live without their wealth in the Rose Motel, which later is the Rosebud Motel.
Yes, it's a great show. I love it. But my favorite motel-related movie, though, is Identity from 2003. I don't know if you guys have seen it or not, but this is a slasher film turned psychological thriller inspired by the 1939 And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And it stars John Cusack, Ray Liotta, and Amanda Peet, and follows 10 strangers in an isolated motel who are temporarily cut off from the rest of the world and are mysteriously killed off one by one.
I've never seen this movie because someone told me the ending, and now I feel like I don't need to see the movie because the whole point of the movie is like you're trying to figure out why they're being murdered. But Identity, I wish I didn't know, but I know, and I can't forget it. And so I've never seen it. And everyone who's people love that movie and they're like, oh, that's too bad. Like every time I tell them like I can't watch it because I already know the ending, I don't, and they're like, oh yeah, well, and I'm just like, man, it's like this thing I missed.
So now that we've caught up to the present by talking about a movie from 2003, it is time for our etiquette segment. So Jackie, what do we have today?
We have part 2 of the guest etiquette from 3 weeks ago. So you guys might remember the last episode that I did etiquette on. I was digging into the second half of the chapter on guest etiquette. So we're just going to continue on with Amy Vanderbilt's list of how to deal with problem guests. So this actually kind of relates now to this episode because those are guests at, like, people usually call people staying at hotels their guests. So see, look, now it's suddenly all of the
now it's all connected.
Now it's all connected, and there was a plan all along. There was not. The plan all along was just to finish this chapter because I I just wanted to finish it. So anyway, here are 3 more problem guests and how to deal with them if you're hosting anyone at your house. So, problem guest number 1, the guests who won't go. So these are the guests who still want a nightcap after all sensible people have indicated the desire to call it a day. And if it's Saturday night with no workday ahead, there's little hope. Some subtle hints that a host could do, though, are don't join them in that nightcap, like pour them that one and then just stare at them while they drink it, and then they might get the hint. You can start gathering up used glasses and ashtrays and just start cleaning around them. If it's cold and you've got like a fire going, don't keep the fire going, just like stop tending the fire. Basically making it as uncomfortable for them as possible, which I appreciate. But if these subtle hints don't work, the hostess could always say, like, oh, Joe's been working pretty hard lately, and I or the doctor want him to get plenty of sleep on weekends, so let's send him to bed now. The inference being that she'll stick it out on the sofa, even if it takes all night. There are people who talk a lot or serious drinkers won't even notice that, like, the man of the house has left, but usually this technique will work, and once one of the hosts is gone, usually they'll get the hint at that point. The one unbreakable rule, though, is that the hostess must stay until the last guest leaves. So you're stuck there until they get the picture. But the only exception would be that if the guests are house guests and they're staying the night anyway, then in that case, you could go to bed and that guest could just stay in the living room listening to music or playing cards, even after the hosts have retired at a relatively early hour. But if you are the guest staying and you just want to stay up in their living room hanging out, you should just make sure to not make so much noise as to keep the rest of the household awake if you're staying up.
It's good to be considerate.
Mm-hmm. So another problem guest, which kind of goes hand in hand with the guest who won't go, are problem drinkers. So many of us know a certain number of problem drinkers of whom we may be fond, but who are difficult and often unpleasant to entertain at home. Where others stop after a social drink or two before dinner in the evening, these people go right on drinking. And how far can a host or hostess go in an effort to control this situation? The best course seems to consider the problem drinker the best course seems to be knowing that this person is going to be there from the start. So, and then you kind of plan your whole evening around accommodating this person. So, for example, you can bring a cocktail shaker into the living room or out onto the terrace before dinner with just enough drinks for everyone to only have 2. Or you can pass around pre-made drinks that you've prepared at the bar or in the kitchen. The trick here is to just not place bottles and soda so people can mix their own, because they're just going to help themselves at that point. So you can pre-portion them out that way. After dinner, again, pass 1 highball, possibly 2, and then say nothing whatsoever about the possibility of any more alcoholic refreshment. So that one's quick and easy. And then the last problem guest, and the end of this chapter, is the obnoxious guest. So the hostess with any experience avoid asking a guest who might well turn out to be a thorn in the side to the other guests present. When it does happen that a hostess finds she has erred in asking somebody highly and unamusingly contentious to a party, she and the host must spend the evening trying to keep the conversation away from explosive topics, or topics that are explosive to this particular guest. If he gets underway and others are growing angry or hurt, the host or hostess breaks in with, perhaps we better continue this some other time, and attempts a diverting technique. The best way to deal with one of these argumentative people is to give the arguer something else to do. So if you have a game room, get someone to take him on at table tennis, or take him for a brisk tour of your grounds. ostensibly to show him something, but really to get him to work off his aggression physically. You can get the troublemaker into a card game, or get him to show off some specialty of his, like magic or card tricks, or piano playing, or tap dancing even.
Ooh.
A man or woman who feels mean and aggressive in company can often be brought pleasantly into the group by being permitted to shine in some acceptable way. And that one I feel like comes up with, like, the one person who won't stop talking about politics at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
You gotta get him to tap dance. It's the only way. So what do you think about these etiquette tips?
I like them, especially the first bit about we'll start cleaning up around them and like start making like comments like, oh, you know what, so and so should go to bed. I love that because I'm pretty sure that I have like started cleaning up in efforts to like move people out when I've hosted. So I totally get it.
Yeah, I think actually in this section, most of these were really useful tips, and these are problem guests that seem timeless to me. Like, these weren't problem people that, or like, they weren't very mid-century problems. Like, these problem guests have stood the test of time. So I think that this was my favorite of all of them. So I'm glad you liked it too. And I think we should approve all of these etiquette tips.
I think so too. So here it is, the approval stamp, which we still don't have a sound effect for. So, and with that, it looks like we have parked on our motel motor court. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show and tell a friend.
You can also follow us on YouTube and Instagram at MCL Podcast. Instagram is the best place to send us feedback and episode suggestions. Send us a DM anytime. And you can also contact us through the Send Us a Text Message feature in the show notes.
Yeah, so thanks for listening, guys, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Bye!
Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.